Hello, and welcome to the Godly Playroom at First United Church. My name is Ruth Lummox, and it is my privilege to be in this room full of stories, and to be able to share those stories not just with folks who live here in the city or the county of Wetaskiwin, but with all of you who are able to watch and participate with these stories online. There's a new story posted every week. And special thanks to Sherry and to Jackie, who have been sharing or will be sharing stories. We have entered into that green and growing season that is between the time of the color orange, creation time, and the time of the color blue, the season of Advent. When you're ready to tell this story and want to find it in the Godly Playroom, it's on the top shelf of the Sacred Story shelf. And we need the desert box as well. Oh, today's story is a Godly Play story called The Exodus, and it is copyright protected and shared with permission. But before we can dive into a story, we need to be ready. This is such a huge story. You'll have heard a bit of it in the story of Moses and the burning bush, but this takes us a little more deeply into the story and into the desert. I wonder what you need to be ready. Maybe not to go into the desert today, but at least to be present in this time together. Maybe like me, you need to remember to turn off a device and make sure that there won't be any interruptions, or at least the interruptions will be kept to a minimum while we're together. Maybe you just need to take a few deep breaths and just settle in and shed some of those other things that have been going on in your life. All those voices that say this needs to be done or don't do that. And just to be here. Maybe you've been able to get outside and enjoy some of the fall weather. It is so beautiful at this time of year. And even more precious because we never know when that first snowfall or frost is going to come. So let's take another deep breath. I heard someone describe it as breathing in the flowers or sniffing the flowers and blowing out the candles. Or you might want to breathe in some flowers and blow those dandelion fluffs. Or blow some leaves, or some bubbles. Are you ready? Well, you may want to find a candle to light as we begin today. Know that you can pause the video at any time if you need to go and find something, either for your response materials a little bit later, or something for feast. I have to pause the video every now and then when I'm in the room, especially if I'm telling the story by myself to a camera. So it's okay to stop when you need. And so we remember that once there was someone who said and did such amazing things that people began to wonder who he was. And one time they just had to ask him, "Who are you?" And one time, when they asked him that question, he said, "I am the light." Watch how the light grows whenever we share it. Sometimes we like to turn off all the lights and just enjoy the light. if you want to do that for a moment or two, go ahead. I'm going to put this candle back on the shelf here and get ready for the story. We'll see you back here in a minute or so. Hi, I hope you were able to get the materials ready that you need. Like I said, this is a big story. This is the desert box. We couldn't fit the whole desert into our room, obviously. But so many important stories happen to the people of God in the desert that we need a bit of it to help us with our stories. The desert is a dangerous place. People don't go into the desert unless they have to. It hardly ever rains in the desert, and so there's very little food that grows, and it's even harder to find water to drink. And without food and water, people die. When the wind blows, the sands move, and the desert is always changing. It's easy to lose your way. The desert is a dangerous place. People don't go into the desert unless they have to. The people of God were living in a place where the rains did not come. Without water, the crops couldn't grow. There was no grain to grind for wheat. Everyone was hungry. The children cried in their sleep. And so the mothers and fathers decided to take their children and travel to a new place where there was food. Even if it meant going across the desert, they just had to. And so they set out. It was a long journey. But they kept moving toward the land of Egypt. in Egypt, the king is called the Pharaoh. And when the people of God arrived in Egypt, the Pharaoh welcomed them. And they found food and work. But many years passed, and another Pharaoh came to power, and he trapped the people. They could not go home. They had to live where the Pharaoh wanted them to live. They had to get up when the Pharaoh wanted them to get up. They had to eat what the Pharaoh wanted them to eat. They had to go to bed when the Pharaoh wanted them to go to bed. They had to work at whatever the Pharaoh wanted them to do. They had to do everything the Pharaoh wanted them to do. They were slaves. One of the people of God, whose name was Moses, went to Pharaoh and said, "God says to let my people go." But Pharaoh said, "No." Many times Moses went back to the Pharaoh and said, "God says to let my people go." And each time the Pharaoh said, "No." Many strange things happened in the land of Egypt. But still the Pharaoh said no. Then a terrible thing happened. The oldest boy in each of the Egyptian families died, even in the house of the Pharaoh. But the oldest boy in the families of the people of God did not die, because they had put a mark on their doors with the Lamb's blood, and the angel of death passed over. This time, when Moses went to the Pharaoh and said, "God says to let my people go," Pharaoh said, "Yes." And so the people began to hurry. They packed everything they could carry. They made bread for the journey. But it wasn't the kind of bread that we find today. They didn't have time to put leaven in and let it rise up and get all big and fluffy like the bread we eat. This bread was flat, and you can still taste it today. It's called matzo. And whenever you taste this bread, you taste this story. The people gathered everything so they could be ready, and they set out. They were in a hurry. They were afraid that Pharaoh would change his mind. And then they heard the sound that no one wanted to hear. The earth began to shake, and the beating of the hooves and the rolling of the chariots sounded like thunder. Pharaoh's army was coming after them. The armies of Pharaoh pushed the people up against the waters. They were trapped. They didn't know what to do. And then God came so close to Moses. And Moses came so close to God that he knew what God wanted. God told Moses to put his staff out over the waters. And when he did, the waters opened up. and the people were able to go through on dry land. And when the people were safely on the other side, the waters closed again, and the armies of Pharaoh could not reach the people. They were free. And they were so happy they couldn't help but sing their thanks. And Miriam led the dancing. I wonder what part of this story you liked best. I wonder what part of this story is the most important part. I wonder if there's any part of this story we could leave out and still have all the story that we need. It's a bit of a puzzling story. And the part that is always hard for me to hear is about the death of those oldest children. And why was Pharaoh so reluctant and so willing to let his people die rather than let the people of God go? You can read more about this story in the book of Exodus in the Bible. There's one on the transition shelf by the desert box, or you might have one at home. Exodus is the second book in the Bible. Genesis, in the beginning, is the first. But Exodus tells the story of the birth of Moses and his call with the burning bush and eventually his return to Egypt. The phrase the Bible uses, Pharaoh's heart was hardened. And sometimes it says even God hardened Pharaoh's heart. And it just doesn't always make sense to me. But I suppose if I want to leave out that part, then I would also have to say I need to do a little more work on my own about those times when I get really stubborn or think I'm right or know what's best and won't listen to anybody else. There's a lot of that going on in the last year or so, with a variety of different opinions about what's right or what's best. So I wonder what part of this story is most like you, or where you might find yourself in this story. I wonder if we'd be willing to go into the desert if that was the only way to freedom. Or what deep waters we might need to pass through. Or whether we trust God to come close to us and help us know the best way. This is a big story. And you can taste this story whenever you taste the matzo. Remember, it's very flat. There's nothing here but flour and water. You can almost taste the excitement. You can almost taste the desert. But whenever you taste the matzo, you taste this story. I'm going to put the story away. And you can begin to think about what you might like to work with in response to this story. I wonder what God is calling out in you. So you might want to find some art materials around your house. Pencil crayons or markers or some paper or scissors, glue. Maybe you even have some sand that you can work with. And we'll put away the waters first. Maybe you just like to work with some water. Oh, just imagine what it would be like to splash our toes in the water all at the beach at this time of year, if it was still warm enough to do that. Or after a hot day in the desert, what just a little bit of water might feel like on our tongue. And then there are all the people of God. Miriam, who is the sister of Moses, who led the dancing. And Moses, who went to Pharaoh and led the people through the waters. And all the mothers and fathers who are willing to go into the desert, to find food for their children. We're actually coming up on the United Nations International Day for the Eradication of Poverty. I think that's what it's called. Sometimes it's also World Food Sunday, that Sunday after Thanksgiving in October. And we're invited to do some thinking about what would we need to do to ensure that all of the children didn't go to bed hungry at night. I'm going to put these story materials away, and you can think about what you want to do in response to the story, or if you need to pause the video to go and get your art materials, and I'll see you back here shortly. So I found some colored sand and some colored salt, I think, which is a little bit like sand, and some glitter. And if you want to make your own colored salt or colored sand, it's really easy. You just put the sand or the salt in a baggie, put a couple of drops of food coloring, or if you're using acrylic paint, maybe just a very little bit of paint, and then make sure your baggie's good and sealed, and you do a bunch of squishing on it. And then open it up and spread it out, let it dry, and pretty amazing what you can have. So is thinking about just how big this story is and how people started in a faraway land. Maybe where they were hungry. Maybe they'd lived there all their lives. I wondered what it was like. For them to leave. How bad would it have to get before we'd risk moving somewhere else? Packing up everybody, even if it meant going across the desert, where there's very little that grows, and there's very little water, and the sands are always changing. It feels a little bit like that right now. Like things keep changing. I'm not quite sure what we're supposed to be doing, or a lot of the things that we used to be able to do, we can't. And I think many people, some of us, have lost our way. I wonder if they had a lot of hope. That's what kept them going. Or maybe when they arrived in Egypt and there was enough food and water for people. Were they hopeful? At least until the Pharaoh trapped them. I don't know if I would be brave enough to be like Moses and to go to Pharaoh and say, this isn't right, things need to change. I think lots of us are really good at looking around and saying, oh, this needs to change, or this is awful. But we're not always willing to stand up and do something about it. I wonder what helped Moses act. Imagine that's a little bit like having enough to eat, or finding an oasis in the desert. Someone acts on our behalf, or does something to make things better. And then to be free. I really want to use these gold sparkles, but the bag's not open, and I know if I try to open it without scissors, I'll end up with gold sparkles everywhere. Well, let's see if I can do it this way. Although, you know, a day without glitter maybe isn't that good a day, so we'll just hope there's a little bit of glitter gets everywhere. And the thing is, we never quite know what that freedom's going to look like until we're willing to cross over. Sometimes that means we leave the familiar behind. I wonder what your work has been in response to this story. I need to clean up a little bit. I'll see you back here with your feast materials as soon as we're done cleaning up our work. Well, here we are, ready for our feast. I couldn't quite bring myself to have more matzo. It's very dry. And then I got wondering what it would have been like if that's all you could eat for a very long time. The people of God, even though they were free, end up being in the desert for a very long time. And not a lot of interesting things to eat in the desert. So I'm grateful that all I have to do is walk across the room and turn on the tap to get some water in my glass. And that it's easy to go to the store and get some snacks that I like. But I know there are lots of families that can't do that. And some families that have to choose between paying their rent or for medication and buying enough groceries. And I think we could do better. Part of our work about addressing poverty and how we start eliminating it is to make sure people have affordable housing and have enough income to meet their basic needs. There's a group of people in the United Church of Canada that are working to encourage our politicians and leaders to do some thinking about what it might be like to have a guaranteed livable income. There are places where it's been tried. And sure, there are always people who take advantage of things. But for the most part, the positive benefits far outweighed any of the people that were doing not good things. People were less anxious, people had access to good food, they could spend time on study, and they weren't sick all the time. It was just all kinds of things that we don't always realize. Just how deeply poverty affects families and communities. Maybe if we put a little more money in at the front end, that would save us money even in the long run. But that's not really the reason to do it. I wonder if we could have the persistence of Moses to keep going back again and again, even when people say, no, that'll never work. But we know it's a good thing, and to figure out a way to make it work. This is a really big story, and it's not over yet. And we are so much a part of it. But our time together is drawing to a close. And so I will invite you to take a moment and offer thanks for the many blessings that are part of your life. Maybe you started doing that on Thanksgiving, but it's a good thing to do at any time of the year. And we forgot to say our prayers before, so instead we say them now, and we offer to the Holy One, thank you, thank you, thank you, God, for the beautiful colors this fall, for warm places and safe places, for people who care, for all of those folks who are doing their very best to keep others safe. Grant us the strength and the persistence to continue to work until all your people are safe and free and have the basics of life: food and water and shelter. And thank you for the relationships that we share. Amen. Watch what happens when I change the light. Right now, it's just in this one place and time. But when we change it, it spreads out so that it is able to fill this room with light. And it'll get thinner and thinner until we can't see it anymore. But just because we can't see something doesn't mean it isn't there. So wherever the light finds you this week, may you know yourself loved and cared for, and may you find a way to share that care with others. God bless. Be well, and look after one another.